Protesters in Los Angeles remain in a standoff with police as President Donald Trump doubles down on his deployment of the National Guard and U.S. Marines. But California Governor Gavin Newsom says the state will sue the president for deploying the military against protesters, an extraordinary power that hasn't been invoked for decades. So let's get more on this with Flinders University senior lecturer in U.S. history, Prudence Flowers. Prudence, good to have you with us this evening. Now, firstly, what is the legal basis for which Gavin Newsom is suing the Trump administration?
Well, he's making a multi-pronged argument, the first of which is that he, as a state governor, has not requested the use of the National Guard and, in fact, has explicitly said that it will inflame the situation. And so this is what Trump is doing, is essentially federalizing the National Guard, which is a highly unusual step. There's also an argument being made about the type of deployment that's occurring. So Trump has not technically invoked he's invoked something called Title 10, which is not the Insurrection Act. And so you can make a legal argument as well that he's using a rarely deployed part of the civil code to kind of test the boundaries of how much control he has over currently enlisted servicemen.
So does he have a case in this instance then? And do you think he might invoke that Insurrection Act?
Trump's been quite interesting. So he's made a few comments so far along the lines of, oh, it's not an insurrection. And I think it would be very hard to make the argument that this is an insurrection, but it's also hard to make the argument that it meets the criteria outlined in the civil code as well. So, I mean, I think on balance, Gavin Newsom and California have a very strong argument that there's not a crisis happening in California. This is not the equivalent of other moments where the National Guard has been deployed. In fact, the deployment of the National Guard and also sending 700 Marines is creating a crisis situation.
Yeah, of course, it's nothing new when it comes to immigration officials detaining illegal immigrants or suspects in this case. But the manner in which currently that ICE agents are rounding up immigrants, and we see that happening in other parts of the U.S., is this in some way unprecedented under a Trump administration?
I think even under the Trump administration, what we're seeing is unprecedented. It's been kind of widely reported that Trump wanted sort of a big splashy enforcement of his border policies to the point where ICE has been told to dramatically lift their quotas of arrests. So, for example, the normal pattern was about 600 arrests a day, and apparently he's requested 3,000 arrests per day for the first 200 days that he's in office. So there's a much higher level of arrest going on. They're targeting people in their workplaces and at schools. All of this is very different even to the rhetoric Trump used on the campaign trail, which was about arresting criminals and gang members.
Yes. And has it ever happened before where a state governor, in this case Gavin Newsom, publicly resists efforts by the president to call in the National Guard and soon the military?
It has happened, although it's always been in kind of complex circumstances. So the major occasions where it's occurred in the 20th century were all to do with the civil rights struggle of African Americans. So there were 4 times in the late 1950s and early 1960s where US presidents federalized the National Guard against the wishes of a governor. But in at least some of those occasions, the governor kind of made it clear that they weren't going to call up the National Guard themselves. And so it's not that they were actively rejecting the use of the National Guard, it's that they wouldn't deploy it. And in those situations, so Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson all deployed the National Guard or federalized the National Guard to protect the civil rights of African Americans. And really what Trump is doing is deploying the National Guard to protect ICE officers.
And is there party politics in play here because California is a democratic state? And do you think perhaps a lot of comparisons have been also made when the January 6th Capitol riots where the president didn't call up the National Guard in that instance?
I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. So on the one hand, Trump has had a lot of grievances with Gavin Newsom before. He memorably gave him the nickname New Scum, which is quite humorous. He also earlier this year suggested that the federal government might not give aid to help California rebuild after the wildfires. So there's definitely a partisan element going on here. And it's also worth noting that Trump was not cavalier about the use of the National Guard in his first term in office. So, for example, he did not call for the use of the National Guard during the Capitol 6 insurrections and, in fact, took a lot of time to tell his supporters to go home. And similarly, he kind of went back and forth during the Black Lives Matter protests about the National Guard. At one point, he supposedly said he did want to call them up and was kind of publicly chastised by the Secretary of Defense. And then later on in September 2020, he said he couldn't do it without governors requesting their use. So his interest in using the National Guard is quite a new development. I think his willingness to do this. And part of the problem, or part of the issue here, is that he's surrounded by people like the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who openly support this kind of escalation and use of the military within US borders. Whereas in his first term, he had many more people surrounding him who were openly critical of those ideas.
So, and just finally, Prudence, when it comes to the military and the National Guard, are there checks and balances on the president, because he is the commander-in-chief, in the manner in which the military is being used for this purpose?
I mean, so currently in the way that he's invoked Title 10, the National Guard are only meant to be there in a kind of supervisory fashion. And so that is an important distinction to note. They're not actually meant to get involved in arrests or things like that. Normally the checks and balances are in place relating to kind of customs and modes of behavior. So Trump, in testing the limits of the law, as he has done in many other areas, is going to test the limits of what those checks and balances are. And I think what we're seeing here is him experimenting with just how much authority he has over the military at this moment in time.
Okay, Prudence Flowers, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much for giving us your thoughts.
Thanks.